Kia ora and welcome to this Manaaki Whenua LINKOnline Webinar. I'm Christine Harper, Manaaki Whenua's Stakeholder Relationship Manager, and my job is helping to join the dots between our research and the questions that our stakeholders are grappling with. Today we're bringing you another aspect of our work to understand New Zealand soils and how they respond to management, this time with a focus on managing soil contamination, which impacts soil health. Jo Kavanagh leads our work on soil health and soil quality, working at the science policy interface to consider the impacts of land management on human health and the environment. Jo's worked a lot with regional councils over the years, and particularly since the implementation of the National Environmental Standards for Soil Contaminants. These focus only on human health, and so we're really interested in how we ensure the ecological aspects of managing soil contaminants is not forgotten. You may have some questions through this presentation. Don't forget to put them in the chat box as soon as you can, and I'll be back again to help manage those questions at the end. But for now, over to you, Jo.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'll just hopefully get things running correctly. Christine, can you just confirm that you can see the slide okay?
Yep, all good.
Cool, excellent. I'm really happy and pleased to be finally giving this presentation. Christine's asked me several times to give a webinar. And so basically, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Sorry, on my screen, I can no longer see my presentation. So I'll just go back to, apologies for that. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Yes, I'm going to be talking about basically ecological aspects of managing soil contaminants, and it goes across a whole range of environments from urban agricultural into pristine natural environments as well. So in terms of the overview of the presentation today, I'll be just giving the overview of how soil contaminants are currently managed in New Zealand, give you a background to how these ecological soil guideline values were developed with a particular focus around the trace element component of that, look at what work has been done in terms of defining the applications of the ecological soil guideline values. Towards the end, I'll also talk a little bit about naturally geochemically mineralised areas. They're areas that have natural elevations of contaminants. It's a bit of a knowledge gap. And then also some other current work around what we call surplus soils, and I'll explain what they are when we get to it. In terms of managing soil contaminants, basically there's an intimate link between protecting soil quality and the management of contaminated land. From a protecting soil quality perspective, there's things like the Regional Council Soil Quality Monitoring, which provides for state of the environment reporting, and a lot of councils do a suite of 7 classic soil quality indicators, but also a suite of trace elements or metals. Through the Cadmium Management Working Group, which is comprised of representatives of central and local government and primary industry sector groups. Then a tiered fertiliser management system has been developed for helping to manage accumulation of cadmium, a contaminant of fertiliser in the system, and the Fertiliser Association of New Zealand's got a really good contains that on their website if you're interested in having a look at that. In terms of preventing soil contamination, there's a lot of regional council consenting processes, in particular around managing discharges so that they don't create contaminated sites, and you'll often see that in regional plans or other council information. There's also aspects around soil disposal where you've got different types of landfills, so that can be clean fills, managed fills, and kind of connected to that is also some industry-based guidelines around waste disposal to land, technical guidance, and organic beneficial use of organic wastes as well, which are sort of have been developed by industries, to inform better practices. And then in the context of contaminated land management, we have the National Environmental Standard to protect human health from soil contaminants. And accompanying that is a whole bunch of contaminated land management guidelines developed by MFE, where the focus is effectively identifying the level of effect so that it can inform remedial or management activities. But throughout this kind of process, basically there's a key gap in soil guideline values or managing soil contaminants to protect ecological receptors. So in terms of what the Eco-SGVs are, they are soil contaminant concentrations, guideline values that are developed to protect terrestrial receptors. And so that includes your soil microbes, your invertebrates and plants. That's primarily what the information is based on, but it does also, we have also looked at accumulation through the food chain. So you're looking at livestock and protection of wildlife as well. They're really, along with any soil guideline value, they're a useful means to assess potential environmental impact, but they shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of assessing that environmental impact. They should, in a lot of cases, trigger further risk assessment to determine what the appropriate actions are from that. In terms of what's been done over the time, this basically kind of started back probably even slightly prior to the 2014 with some work that was done for the Cadmium Management Group, looking at how you might derive soil guideline values to protect ecological receptors. This was funded through an EnviroLink Tools project where a bulk of the technical work was done over those 2 years, and it was completed in 2016. Through that work, we developed soil guideline values for 11 priority contaminants. These were largely identified on the basis of contaminants that had been picked up in a lot of previous technical guidance developed by MFE. Coming out of that, we identified some of the next steps that needed to occur, which was a technical review of the development, as well as better development of the legislative framework around using these soil guideline values. Since that time, there was international guidance released in 2017, which helped to inform the technical aspects of the derivation of this. A review was undertaken in 2018, and this led to a refinement and a technical update of the numbers in 2019. Just this year, we completed a medium advice grant in June, which was basically following up on that second aspect around the legislative framework and focused on looking at the application of these numbers, particularly in our changing regulatory environment, and also with a specific focus around more explicitly integrating Te Ao Māori perspectives. In terms of a really brief overview of the method, because it's really important to just have a little bit of insight into how we've developed these numbers, because it's important in the context of particularly naturally occurring substances, which are these trace elements or a lot of metals, metalloids are the key things. And the ecological soil guideline values are a combination of what's currently existing, the background concentrations, and then this added component. So focusing on the background concentrations, there was some work that we did in 2015, which enabled us to develop up estimates of what you might be considering the background naturally occurring concentrations across New Zealand. That was based on a lot of geological information, and those coloured pictures that you see in that sign there were basically the areas that we were able to develop numbers for. It was a fairly limited subset of data, and over the last couple of years, actually, we've been working with GNS to get analysis of a greater spread of data, and so there's some refinement and updates to those background concentrations that we've undertaken, and that will be kind of a part of the ongoing work as well. So that's the background component. And when we're talking about trace elements, there are a range of elements that are present in the Earth's crust at really tiny concentrations. Some of them are essential elements, things like copper, zinc, cobalt, molybdenum, boron. People will understand those in the agricultural, agrochemical context. Some of these are intentionally applied for beneficial uses such as micronutrient, fertilisers, also for helping to manage agricultural crops, such as pesticides. Historically, things like lead arsenate. We've got copper used as copper fungicides, zinc for facial eczema treatment. Historically, we've also had petrol, lead in petrol as well. Sometimes they're present as contaminants in other products or as a result of things like industrial activities. And some of those are like cadmium, fluoride, uranium in phosphate fertilizers. Got lead-based paint as well. Inappropriate disposals of industrial waste can also lead to some contaminations. Application of some wastes to land for beneficial purposes can also result in the application of contaminants to the soil as well. And did just want to highlight that there are natural elevations in certain geologies, and what you might call geochemically mineralised areas. That's kind of part of the reason we have mining. That's where, because that is where a lot of there is natural elevations, and mining can occur in those areas, but sometimes there's also natural elevations in other areas. So in terms of the types of trace elements that the ecological soil guideline values were developed for, that's the suite there. Will be fairly well recognised for people that are that work in this space. It's a fairly standard suite of elements. We did look at fluoride as well and developed some provisional estimates on that, but the data is quite limited in that, and there's was some further work that we did for the Fertiliser Association to inform how you could actually improve those numbers as well if there was the desire. And just for completeness, these are the contaminants for which we developed, organic contaminants for which we developed the ecological soil guideline values. So fairly limited range, but some common ones like DDT, total petroleum hydrocarbons, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And for those last ones, there were 2 specific PAHs that we developed numbers for. So going back to the methodology, when we're looking at negative effects of contaminants, basically it's that added component that we're interested in knowing about the concentrations that actually might result in the effects. And so how we determine that is based on using information from the literature. So it's the toxicity data in particular, which looks at longer term effects such as effects on reproduction or growth, as opposed to just killing organisms. So you're getting that more subtle effects. Then we also build in components around accounting for the aging and leaching, which reduces the availability of these contaminants to the organisms. And where possible, where data is available, then we'll also look at different soil types. And so we could only do this for copper and zinc. And there were 3 groupings of soils that we looked at, which was this, what we called sensitive, typical, and tolerant. Once you've got all that data, then we used what was called the Berlioz software. That's actually was software that was developed by CSIRO in Australia and was used to develop the ANZAC water quality guidelines, was also used in Australia to develop their ecological investigation levels as well. And the original Eco-SGVs that we developed were based on different levels of protection for different land uses. But in terms of the output that you get from the software, this is very hypothetical and modified, but it kind of basically goes like this. You get this curve of the information, which looks at the percentage of population affected alongside with the concentration. And as you can see from this figure, you can come up with any range of technically correct information for the ecological soil guideline value, ranging from, in this case, 0.6 to probably about 200. So it's really important that you understand the context in which this is being used to determine which data and which protection level you're aiming for. So for the Eco-SGVs, we tended to use, we did use the what we call the EC30, the lowest observed effect concentration, and different levels of protection that was developed in conjunction with central and local government representatives as well. But despite all the technical work that's been done to date, it's still not widely used, primarily as a result of a lack of national direction and consensus on application. So that really was the driver, if you like, to obtain some EnviroLink funding for a medium advice grant. That, coupled with the changing legislative background, to undertake some further work focusing on the application of the Eco-SGVs and integrating Te Ao Māori aspects into this as well. And so that was largely centred around some workshops that we ran with Māori and central and local government, and then followed up with some end user workshops as well, so we get that key input into it. There's a current tools project where we're continuing on with and undertaking a more detailed policy and regulatory assessment of the values, as well as this sustainable management of the surplus soils. And a key point with both of these projects is there's an advisory group that's formed and is carrying through both the projects, and that includes representatives from central government, so MFE, MPI, DOC, as well as regional unitary and district councils, industry, contaminated land industry representatives through Wastemans, and Māori representatives as well. when we ran the first workshop, we thought it'd be useful to have a series of questions that we focus the discussion around. And so this included, as you can kind of read there, the desired outcomes, how could they be used, what actions should be triggered. And as I mentioned, a key component of the first development of the Eco-SGVs focused on land use categories. And so a key question that we asked there was, are those categories appropriate? Is any differentiation on the basis of land use appropriate? And then we also covered off on some aspects around the background soil concentration as well. So some of the aspects that came out around Te Ao Māori was just having that enhanced understanding of cultural values and the key concepts in the soil and land management. And a lot of that builds on some excellent work that Garth Harmsworth had done through the Soil Health MB program that Manaaki Whenua had that has just been recently completed. So we're able to continue extending that and building on that. In the context of the issue that we're talking about, one really pertinent point that came through was the notion of the mixing of soils, which could be either contaminated with uncontaminated soils, or the issue associated with moving soils from one area to another. Basically, you're looking at soils with different whakapapa, and people are more familiar with that in the context of streams and aquatic environments, but it's also equally applicable in a terrestrial soils environment as well. And so then looking at it from those cultural values in different contexts, the papakainga, food harvest areas, and other culturally important and significant sites. And so it's really around bringing together the environments in which you might use these values to inform particularly the management and rehabilitation of soils in culturally important areas. In terms of looking at the fit with current and future legislation, obviously there'll be a hangover from our current sort of setup, under the RMA, through council plans and so on. So what we're looking to do within the tools project is, is develop a guidance document that can inform usage under this existing regime, but with a really kind of eye on the future and identifying those opportunities where we can connect with the future legislation, which includes the Natural and Built Environment Act, which we should get to see the next update within this month, the National Planning Framework, the Strategic Planning Act. We've now had the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land that has been released as well. There's also changes in the Environmental Reporting Act. So these are all things that we're trying to keep an eye on and help inform how these values could be used. And it is a moving feast at the moment. There's a very clear signal within the NBA that there's targets and limits to protect human health and ecological integrity of the environment. And so that's just some phrasing of what's been deemed as could be different limits. This table's a little bit busy, but the key point to kind of take from this in terms of the revised application of the Eco-SGVs is that we've done away with land use. The focus is around different levels of protection for different actions. In the context of protecting soil quality, the focus is primarily around what we've called a target limit value, and that's at 95% protection of the soil ecological receptors. It's applicable in a bunch of contexts that I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. But there's both classic sort of coverage as well as aspects in there from a Māori perspective. In a contaminated land context, there's probably less of a focus around using that 95% protection level, but they could be used as remediation targets. And because I can never say it enough, it's like, do not ever use these numbers as remediation targets for copper and zinc. There's a whole bunch of other ways that you can manage elevated concentrations of copper and zinc that are better than digging it up and dumping it. Then there's two kind of trigger values. One's a soft, what I've termed a soft trigger value, which just is intended to get land managers and landowners thinking a little bit more about, okay, we need to actually start understanding what the sources of these contaminants are to our site. What are the options to mitigate these? So you can work towards reducing those concentrations over time. And then there's at a lower protection level, that 60% component. Then there's basically termed at a hard trigger level, where there's basically a greater expectation around action to improve the environment. And particularly that improving the environment, kind of comes through more strongly in the Natural and Built Environment Act, where there's that focus around enhancing the ecological integrity. So in terms of the protection of soil quality, there's kind of you can basically divide it into two components. There's this an awareness raising function, which I've kind of grouped particularly for the Regional Council State of the Environment reporting. You've got this ongoing reporting. You can use these numbers to identify when they're starting to be potential problem areas. In terms of production land, where you've got people managing the land for production, food production and so on, then there's also, I think, an awareness raising component in that as well. And so it's things around the development of fact sheets to inform growers around the what concentrations are good, where just being aware of how they might be applying contaminants to land. And there's some good examples that were on cadmium management for different purposes that was developed through the Cadmium Management Group, and you can find those on the MPI and primary sector industry websites as well. And then there's also what I've termed special non-regulatory use, and that's particularly from in a lot of the contexts for Māori that are of interest to Māori in terms of Marakai, around maraes and so on. Also community gardens, where is another example of where that information and awareness is useful. These also need to be considered in the context of human health protection, as well as considering what's the amount of food being consumed to get an understanding of the effects. This just gives you a feel for sort of what some of the numbers are that are coming out with the ecological, to protect the ecological receptors. Those numbers in italics are the ones which are soil contaminant standards that have been developed for the protection of human health. So you can see in some instances the human health values are lower than the protecting the ecological receptors, which is why you always need to take into account both aspects of protection to achieve the best environmental outcomes. The second component to protecting your soil quality is around that compliance and consenting component. That's particularly in the relation to discharge of water, solid materials, to land. And then it also comes into play when you're looking at landfill waste acceptance criteria, particularly for classes 3 to 5, which is things like managed landfills, clean fills, and particularly for the clean fills, there's often the criteria set on the basis of background concentrations, which may be, and so the 95th percentile of the background concentration range might be used, but in some instances that may actually be higher than the ecological soil guideline values. So there's a bit of a tension there in terms of protecting the environment. A final component is actually considering what soils are being used to replace what might have kind of come off, particularly where you're looking at specific organic products. You want to ensure that what you're bringing back onto the soil is also going to be protective of the ecological receptors. From a contaminated land management perspective, just really wanted to emphasise that they don't override those human health values. Depending on which contaminants you're looking at, then the human health aspects may be more important than the ecological receptors. And so the brackets there just indicates that we, within the medium advice grant, we also looked at a combined human health and ecological receptor value. So you're just looking at one number, but you know that it actually protects both human health and ecological receptors. And that was based on the current soil contaminant standards for those national environmental land uses that are picked up in the National Environmental Standard. In terms of guidance around how you might use it under the existing regime, it's kind of easier to keep consistent with the same triggers as the National Environmental Standard. So effectively that's land disturbance, there's guidance in form of the Contaminated Land Management Guidelines. But as has been noted through the various end user workshops and other workshops, key gap is that under the existing regime is that where contaminated sites that don't undergo a land use change, then they don't get picked up in current management practices. Some of the key changes and the differences and information that we need to provide is that simply there is a requirement that you actually consider on-site ecological receptors, in particular the microbes, plants and soil invertebrates are applicable across pretty much any land use. And that's during preliminary site investigations and detailed site investigations. As I flagged earlier, we've also looking at the same ecological soil guideline values applying across all land uses, which is different to what's in the National Environmental Standard. The potential exception is that we're looking at commercial sealed or really compacted kind of driveways or parking lots, then it's not really that applicable to be caring about what the contaminant load is, other from potentially leaching effects on the ecological receptors. And so there's a little bit of a difference around those types of land uses. And as I mentioned, within the tools project, we're doing that next phase of a closer policy and regulatory look as much as we can in this changing environment, and looking to develop that framework and guidance that hopefully supports a transition from the current practices into the new regime. In terms of the actions in a contaminated land management perspective, that 95% protection level, it really comes down to that awareness, just an awareness raising, component, and that potential for use of some remediation targets. There's kind of a step up, if you like, in that site investigation trigger level, that 80% protection level, where you could write it in that there's a more explicit requirement that the site investigation report includes options for assessing or mitigating that risk, reducing the ongoing inputs into the site, and it also has value in identifying contaminated land for those environments where human health isn't the driver. So that's particularly copper and zinc, because currently there's no triggers to actually look more closely at that. Once you get down to that limit hard action level, then that's where there's that greater expectation around looking at what actions you can actually take to improve the environment. And a key thing from this is understanding, is reducing that incentive for just digging and dumping, on triggering further risk assessment to understand what's the relative benefits of the different remediation impacts compared to what it is if it's just being left as is. So it's just understanding the risks and the relative benefits. So there is a document that will be available on the EnviroLink website if it's not up there already, in terms of what came out of the medium advice grant. There's still some areas that require further guidance and consideration, particularly around the use of background concentrations as to how you might be able to adjust the Eco-SGVs on the basis of the varying background concentrations, looking at closer regional and national determination of background concentrations. And we're hoping to get a little bit of further funding through EnviroLink to cover off on a little bit more detail of that. There is a key gap around these, what I've called these mineralised areas, that I'll talk to in the next slide. And then there's also guidance around the sampling and consideration of ecological receptors in contaminated site investigations, and some of that will be picked up in the tools project. But I know already that a key knowledge gap coming out of the work that we've done to date is around these naturally mineralised areas. And we know that there's specific areas that have naturally elevated trace elements. They're tied to particular types of geologies. And whilst the general areas are known, the more specific locations are unknown. The areas that I've got circled there are some of the key areas of where there's known to be elevations, but the more specific geographical information is unknown. And one of the key issues is that the elevated concentrations can flow out of those areas that are recognised to be elevated into areas that are not recognised to be elevated. And that's one of a key issue that I see in a lot of the management, particularly around Nelson Marlborough area, where it's likely to be elevated and coming from natural sources. And this has implications in relation to the NES and the reference to background concentrations in there. But you get this challenge around, well, is it above or below background? Do we need to do anything with it? It also influences where and how you can dispose of different soils to different landfills. And there's some really cool techniques. This is some radiometric images of Southland, but you can kind of see, you really get a sense of the flow and the fine variations that you can get of those elements outside of the mineralised areas into different environments, and how distinctly different that can be, and the need around better understanding how you can using that information. Some of these areas are also associated with naturally rare ecosystems, but also from a more fundamental level, there's in these environments and natural elevations, and the ecological receptors are adapted to those environments. We don't know what the resilience is under climate change, components, but there is some level of adaptation, which is different to people. We're not adapted to these elevated concentrations. So there's a difference in the risks associated with these natural, between people and the ecological and receptors, as well as natural versus anthropogenic elevations. There's also some really interesting stories from Maori oral histories around the use of some of these, the waters from some of these areas for as medicine, some of the plants. Other stories about knowing that these environments are just not okay or very different. So there's some really interesting cultural connections there. But fundamentally, it comes down to we need to have a better understanding of what's happening inside and outside of these naturally mineralised areas to inform the management of potentially toxic elements in soils.
Jo,
So,
I'm going to have to stop you there because we've actually run over our time.
Oh no, that's terrible.
So rest assured, we will share the slides. We will share links to some of these interesting documents that Jo has started us exploring. I can see that there's so much more here that I'm embarrassed to stop us, but I know that lots of people have tight schedules and meetings to go to. Thanks to everyone that has put questions in the question box. We will have Jo working on those later this week to get some responses back to you. There's some great questions there. We will be back. Look, she had so many great more slides. We'll be back with a follow-up to this next year, but in the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking to you about one of our interesting biosecurity topics. So if you're interested in mice or slugs or eradication, watch your email tomorrow because there'll be another interesting instalment from Manaaki Whenua there. I'd like to say thanks to everyone who's still online. Thank you, and thanks for coming along, and a big thanks to Jo for a great presentation. We'll say goodbye for now and look forward to picking up these conversations with you. Bye.